Thank you all for taking out time and attending this webinar, the first of the webinar series on ethical and legal challenges in research in preventive vaccines and making approved vaccines accessible, scheduled between 7th and 21st November. I'm Sarojini, one of the co-organizers of this webinar series associated with Samaj and People's Health Movement. The main objective of this webinar series is to reflect on the ethical and legal dimensions in research, development, and access to COVID-19 vaccines through a process of public engagement with diverse stakeholders. We are expecting a lot of experiences, perspectives, and insights to be shared during the discussions, which will be focused on COVID vaccines. But we hope that they will also construct and consolidate the learning for future vaccine research, development, and use beyond COVID vaccines. According to the Union Health Minister, nearly 30 vaccine candidates are under development by the industry as well as the academic research institutions, and some of them are in the advanced preclinical development stage. Recently, the ministry has also announced that the COVID vaccine distribution will follow the same pathways as with the current vaccines under the Universal Immunization Program, and that the vaccines would be available by mid 2021. Pharma companies in the process of manufacturing the vaccines, such as Serum Institute, Zydus, they have already announced the availability of the first batch of vaccines as early as January to March 2021. So, manufacture of vaccines, approvals, availability, distribution through the UIP are varied dimensions, issues around which will be deliberated through webinar series. Just yesterday, the Health Ministry mentioned that Anganwadi centers, schools, panchayat buildings, etc., would be used extensively in addition to healthcare facilities as vaccination sites. And it is important to look into the health system preparedness, particularly at the community level when the vaccine gets introduced into UIP. The current desperation demands efficient but measured response that combines compassion with science and ethics. The speed created by the warping of scientific and ethical steps ought not to be converted into a pursuit of speed that cuts corners of science and ethics. So, various considerations are necessary prior to making vaccines available without compromising on the ethics and science from the vaccine trial design and development, scientific validity to its approval and distribution. As concerned public health, bioethics, and medical legal practitioners and initiators of the webinar series, we think that the current situation requires urgent reflection in order to iterate focus on science and ethics in the context of the research development and particularly access to and distribution of vaccines. We strongly believe that the webinar series and this space for a public engagement, it will contribute to a collective consolidation of knowledge and perspectives on this extremely critical and topical issue. It is an initiative by Dr. Yogesh Jain, Amar Jasani, Veena Johari, Chenu Srinivasan, and Sarojini, that's me. And specific webinars 2 and 4 were supported by Sandhya Srinivasan and Kajal Bharadwaj. The moderator for webinar 1 is Dr. Amar Jasani, an independent researcher and teacher in bioethics and public health. He is a co-founder of the Forum for Medical Ethics Society and its journal, Indian Journal of Medical Ethics, since 2012, its editor. He is a visiting faculty at Anapoya University, Mangalore, the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Culture, Karachi, and Kenya Medical Research Institute, Nairobi. He is a member of the research ethics committees of Tata Institute of Social Sciences and MSF. Look forward to your participation, not just in this webinar 1, but also in the other webinars and also in the subsequent follow-up work. Thanks to all of you for joining today. And over to you, Amar.
Thank you very much, Sarojini. And thanks to all the participants for being there, large in number. I hope we will have good presentations and discussions. Uh, Let me introduce the topic today because it is very important to emphasize this topic as compared to what is being discussed at the moment in the country. And at the moment in the country, it is as if assumed that there is going to be a vaccine. And there will be going to be a very smooth sailing of the vaccine research. And once that vaccine comes to us, we will deliver, and that's how all the people with logistical and technical skills are coming forward to put together something in place so that the delivery is done. And then we will, conquer the infection that or the pandemic. So this is what is the narrative today. This seminar series is slightly different. I think what we are trying to do is that we want everybody who comes here and listen to it, apply their mind and try to understand from the very beginning, and that is how the vaccine candidates which are taken up for research are developed, what process they go through, and when they come to the human trials, how do we actually make a judgment that the trial has proved that this vaccine is really going to work and it is not going to harm people. This whole process is very, very important because in this process, a lot of things can happen. And the more people know generally as a part of the larger public discourse, know about the transparency, good intention, the commitment of those who are developing this vaccine, the better appreciation will be there from the people to go and take this vaccine. People having less trust about the process by which the vaccine is developed leads to what is called vaccine hesitancy. People become reluctant. People think that, well, I being, treated as a guinea pig, So that is a big question. Many times it happens that a lot of people, mainly those who are, very motivated by nationalism, patriotism, altruism, I want to sacrifice my life to save the humanity kind of people. They come forward to participate in the vaccine trial during pandemic of this kind. But people in general are very apathetic and they said, no, we don't need it. So we have to bridge that gap, the enthusiasm of the participants and the less than enthusiastic people who are supposed to have vaccine. So this series is actually to understand that part, to have a better rational understanding so that we are able to appreciate efforts being made in a right manner and also ensure that these efforts are made in a transparent manner by making demands related to that. Anyway, keeping that in mind, the 5 webinars that we are trying to organize will start with science and ethics. It will go into the experiences of those who are actually doing experiment with the vaccines today. That means participants who are taking vaccine and becoming, the subject or the volunteers there, the researchers, the companies, the government regulator, and the journalists who are supposed to report on it. We'll have that in the second seminar. Third, we'll see whether our regulator, the government regulator for vaccine trials, as well as the provision of approval of the vaccine once it is ready, whether they are doing their good job or not. And the last 2 are related to the intellectual property and the public health, larger issues. So we have this 5 one. We start with the first. Science is very important. We have to ensure that the science is valid and science is in the public interest. So there we have the first speaker, who is a scientist who actually is involved in development and functioning of the immune system of the human being. He was formerly a faculty member, a senior researcher there at the National Institute of Immunology in New Delhi, a national institute with a well-known name internationally. He has also worked closely with civil society groups and involved in science education and at the interface of science and society. We have requested him to talk about the vaccine candidates what are the different issues involved in the way vaccine trials are designed, and what kind of outcomes and the safety issues that these vaccine trials are going to measure. So Satyajit, are you ready? Satyajit Rath, yeah, he is there, and we start with him, and then we go to the next one. Yeah, please, Satyajit.
Thanks, Amar. So, as Amar pointed out, I am mandated by Amar and colleagues to talk about the vaccine candidates and trials with a set of concerns for us to keep as backdrop to the succeeding issues that the webinar series will bring up. So here's how I'm going to do this over the next 14 minutes. We're going to talk about the types of vaccine candidates. I am extremely reluctant to mention them even fleetingly as vaccines. They're all vaccine candidates unless and until they've been formally validated and approved by regulatory processes. The successes, strengths, and weaknesses of which we will discuss in subsequent webinars. I'm going to point out the sort of scientific technical categories of vaccine candidates, and I'm going to make reference to which of those categories, let me call them platforms, using a term that's become very popular technologically. Which of these platforms have had prior success and which have not, and therefore are first in the field in the COVID-19 context. I'll also make some mention about manufacturing issues, which I think will have relevance for low and medium income country manufacturing and access. The second issue that I will deal with technically is the placebo issue, and what placebos are used, what's being compared with what, and are there concerns that we perhaps should have about whether the placebo being used is appropriate, both in terms of the efficacy of the vaccine, but also in purely scientific terms. And as Amar pointed out, I will also talk about clinical trial design issues with specific reference. I'm not going to discuss everything to do with design trials. Shantanu Tripathi will clearly have much more to say about this. I am going to primarily talk about the endpoints and the scientific issues that are brought up by the endpoints that both regulatory authorities and vaccine trial companies have set up for themselves. And some of that conversation will talk about the numbers of trial participants and the time windows during which the trial will be expected to throw up robust, reliable data. So first off, let me start with a formal document. That's the WHO draft landscape document, which WHO periodically posts to their website. This is the document on the 3rd of November. I don't expect anybody to read this. Please, nobody get agitated that it's small print. I am going to go to the next slide and do summaries, which is where I will spend most time. So based on that, here's what the current global COVID-19 vaccine candidate landscape looks like. The first issue is stages. So we have, as of this past week, we have 10 vaccine candidates in phase 3 clinical trials, meaning efficacy trials. We have 37 candidates in clinical evaluation prior to phase 3, meaning in phase 1 and phase 2 trials. We have 155 that are at some stage of preclinical evaluation, and I suspect that this number is larger because pretty much every alternate colleague of mine across the world that I talk to is trying to make a vaccine candidate. So I'm pretty sure that the 155 is simply a formal underestimate. It's useful for us to keep the routes and doses in mind for obvious reasons. Routes because particularly in India, we are very familiar with the one major large-scale campaign of recent years for vaccination, and that's the oral polio vaccination. And oral polio vaccination, despite all its manifold limitations, had one easy component, which was the route. So it's in that context, it's notable that all 10 of these phase 3 vaccine trials are by intramuscular injection. In the 37, which are in the second tranche of vaccine candidates competing for getting there, there are 2 intradermal, which is into the skin, not under the skin, but into the skin, which requires a different kind of training and skill to administer. There's one that is subcutaneous, that is under the skin, and there are 2, and perhaps one more. My guess is that that one is being explored in both injectable and oral ways, which are oral and not injections. Thinking about doses, because again, for a successful vaccine implementation, the sheer logistics of implementation demand that we have some idea of what the doses are. So 9 in the phase 3 clinical trials out of 10 need 2 doses, and very variably, they're between 2 to 4 weeks apart. So some are 2 weeks apart, some 3 weeks, and some 4 weeks apart. Only 1 in the phase 3 clinical trials is a 1-dose vaccine. In the 37 that are in early clinical evaluation, 1 needs 3 doses, 7 need 1 dose, and 30 need 2 doses that are 2 and 4 weeks apart. As you can see, both the routes and the doses are made for complexity, and they are particularly made for complexity because, as I thought when I was listening to Amar laying out our expectations, we are all expecting that a vaccine will be deployed. When the messy reality is that many of these vaccines are likely to be deployed simultaneously, messily, competitively, and with manufacturing and related difficulties. And based on that, let me talk about vaccine candidate platforms. So infectious virus, which is the classical attenuated vaccine, such as the oral polio vaccine, no candidate so far out of the first 47 that I have found deals with this. Non-infectious virus, which is whole virus, that is simply inactivated and therefore can be injected intramuscularly or subcutaneously. 3 out of the first 10 in phase 3 trials are non-infectious virus. Those who are following this will remember that the Indian vaccine trial of the Indian Council of Medical Research and Bharat Biotech together is also this kind of a whole inactivated virus vaccine trial. 4 of the 37 in early stage clinical evaluation are also in the same category. Non-infectious virus has a number of issues. In the first place, you are giving the immune system a large number of targets. It's not clear that all of those targets are relevant for protection. Many of them might be, but it's not clear that all of them are relevant for protection. Number 2, the inactivation process fidelity and robustness becomes a point of weakness, and whether the virus is truly inactivated or not, whether batch inactivation is properly monitored or not, becomes an issue. With non-infectious virus immunizations, people have been reporting with other viruses previously that antiviral antibody-mediated enhancement of disease has been something of an issue. That's not necessarily true at all for the present candidates, but it is nonetheless something to keep in mind. And finally, as I said, manufacturing issues also need to be kept in mind. Non-infectious virus is made from infectious virus, which means that you have to grow industrial scale infectious virus first, and that creates its own safety and scale problems for manufacturing. And therefore, whether one can generate these quantities of non-infectious virus-based vaccines as to provide sufficient sourcing for global immunization becomes a question that is worth asking. So that's the non-infectious virus platform. The second platform that's very common, the non-infectious virus platform, on the other hand, has been shown to be successful for a variety of viral vaccines and therefore is a tried and tested platform. The replicating viral carrier, there are none in phase 3 trials. 4 of 37 in early stage clinical evaluation are replicating viral carrier. And what that means is that SARS-CoV-2 virus gene coding for target proteins, mostly coding for the spike protein, have been inserted onto what are thought of as harmless viruses that can cause limited infection and therefore set up an immune response that will therefore not cause disease itself, but will cause an immune response both against the viral carrier and against the SARS-CoV-2 virus proteins. There's a whole range of potential difficulties about these carriers, as also for the next category, which is the non-replicating viral carrier. And neither of those has been, properly speaking, approved as a vaccine, nor have DNA vaccines, nor have RNA vaccines. There are an occasional exception to that in very roundabout fashion. But by and large, all of these are new platform technologies for building vaccines. As I said, 4 of the phase 3 trial candidates are non-replicating viral carriers, and 5 of 37 in early stage evaluation. DNA vaccines, this is where instead of putting in a viral carrier to cause either a very limited or a slightly limited infection, you actually inject DNA and allow the cells of the body itself to take up the DNA and to make viral proteins from it. 5 of 37 early stage clinical evaluation candidates are DNA vaccines. 2, very dramatically, are not even DNA injections, but RNA injections in lipid nanoparticles that hopefully will simply make quick protein and allow for immunization. The last one, which is the last category, which is the protein category, there is a whole range. Only one in the first set of 10 phase 3 clinical trial candidates, the Novavax candidate, is protein-based, but 15 of 37 in the early stage clinical evaluation are protein stage. This is the only platform that is widely tried and tested for vaccine design. All the others are relatively new. As is obvious, I hope I'm primarily providing information rather than making my own exasperated commentary on it. What are the outcomes for trials? And pretty much all the outcomes for trials is based on the number of virologically confirmed symptomatic COVID-19 cases counted 2 weeks after the second dose of vaccine, or in some cases, 1 dose after the second dose of vaccine. So there are 2 limitations here. This is not an endpoint that tests all infections, because we know that SARS-CoV-2 infections in the majority of individuals infected are asymptomatic, or so mildly symptomatic that many people will treat it as asymptomatic, which the only way to screen that, I remind everybody, is, for example, if the vaccinated individuals, whether placebo or test, in the clinical trials were weekly tested for the presence of virus. This, the companies have said. Keep also in mind that all the vaccine trials are company-sponsored vaccine trials. A point I'll come to in just a minute. Amar, can I go for 2 minutes more?
Please, yes.
So what this is doing is trying to thread the needle of getting as many cases as possible, as quickly as possible, as cheaply and as logistically easily for the trial purposes as possible. It's not an unreasonable outcome. But when you couple it with the regulatory requirement for efficacy, which is 50% efficacy and not less than 30% at the lower limit with a 95% confidence interval, which means, I remind everybody, that if there are 100 cases occurring in the control group, in the placebo group, and 50 or less cases occurring in the test group, that's it. That will fulfill this 50% efficacy and not less than 30% at lower limit with 95% confidence interval. A reasonable set of concerns is that this might be achieved so quickly that placebo effects due to non-specific immune activation will not be definitively ruled out. And what do I mean by that? Remember what the previous slide says, that there are viral carriers, either replicating or non-replicating viral carriers. These viral carriers generate their own innate immune responses. And everybody is aware that there's a great deal of conversation globally about how the polio vaccine might be providing some temporary protection, how BCG might be providing some temporary protection, how a whole range of this kind of non-specific innate immune protection over the short term might in fact be useful. That's a conversation all of us have heard in the media. Here's a problem. If the protection that is being discovered in these vaccine trials is within the first month or two, then what is the formal evidence that this protection is because of the, for example, the antibody response or the T-cell response that is specific to SARS-CoV-2 targets and is not caused by this innate virus-mediated immune activation? And that is an issue that will bring me to placebos. Anything that is completed, any trial that's completed in an extraordinarily short duration of a couple of months, the duration of protection will be an enormous unknown. But not only that, because a large number of the participants will still be generating the antibody responses, the robustness of the immunological protective correlates are likely to be very weak. Finally, let me point out some related issues simply to end with. In some trials, the frequency of adverse reactions is measured purely for a short 1 week period. In many other trials, a 1 year, between 6 months to 1 year adverse event follow-up is a primary outcome, but those are mostly uncoupled from efficacy test trials. What that means is that if regulatory authorities simply depend on the initial efficacy test trial outcomes, they will be depending only on the extremely short-term adverse event data for the initial approval and licensing. And that's something that I think we need to discuss. All trials do not include those who are particularly susceptible. Some trials include elderly individuals, some do not. I haven't as yet come up with any trial description that formally accounts for other comorbidities when we know that for SARS-CoV-2 and serious COVID-19, comorbidities, including age, which some of us suffer from, are clearly the primary concern as far as disease severity is concerned. Some trials include pre-screening for prior exposure, some don't. This becomes an issue in part because we have the concern of prior exposure mediated disease enhancement on the one hand. We also need to see whether prior exposure changes the vaccine response. It introduces a heterogeneity, a variation in trial protocols that it's not clear to me has been properly dealt with. And finally, some give placebo information, some don't. Lots of the trial descriptors actually don't say what the placebo is. Some of them say that normal saline is used as a placebo. Some of them say that the alum or other adjuvant Adavax is being used as a placebo, which is mostly the case with the protein vaccine platform technologies. But for example, at least some of the viral vector mediated vaccine trials are using a completely different vaccine that's not based on a viral vaccine platform, such as a meningococcal vaccine, as the placebo. And as I just pointed out, this is likely to create problems. Finally, just a quick point of a letter in the Lancet from Ana Maria Henao Restrepo and the WHO Solidarity Vaccine Trial Expert Group. The COVID-19 vaccine trials should seek worthwhile efficacy. This was published in the Lancet quite some time ago. This is an idea that the WHO and a group of countries have been pressing very hard for. And I'm out of time. There are very clear advantages to doing solidarity vaccine trials multinationally, multi-vaccine, to generate information for worthwhile efficacy. And what has come in the way is not simply vaccine nationalism, but also vaccine capitalism. Pharma companies have absolutely, as far as I can tell, refused to participate in any such comparative clinical trials, when a comparative clinical trial is really what we need. And since this was 15 minutes, I've already gone way over. I will leave people with this Lancet letter, which in its weakest possible public health perspective is still apparently not acceptable to the developers of the vaccine at large. So I'll stop there. I will simply point out that the bulk of these vaccines are a peculiar combination. Many of them, by no means all of them, but many of them are designed by publicly funded academic research groups and are brought to trial by the private sector pharma industry. And that combination is also something that we should be discussing as we go forward with these webinars. I apologize, Samar, I went over and I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to summarize everything in 15 minutes because it's a massive topic. And but you have covered all the essential part. What we are seeing is that a pandemic which threatens the human existence is not being responded by a very coordinated efforts to develop vaccine. Each company is being given leeway to do the way they want to do it. So there will be a lot of replication, overlap, and wastage, and all kind of stuff. Both resources as well as science. So that is what is happening. You can also, also talked about. Many people have written about it, saying that outcome measure is such that almost no vaccine is going to fail, perhaps. So you design it in such a manner that you ultimately have a vaccine where you are not very sure about how great it is going to be. Same thing is about adverse event. All those things have a big bearing on people coming forward to participate in the vaccine research. So we will take questions only after 3 presentations are done. So we go to a second one that is going to be Dr. Shantanu Kumar Tripathi. Dr. Shantanu is from Kolkata. He is like Dr. Satyajit Rath is a doctor, but Satyajit went into immunology, while Dr. Shantanu went into the clinical pharmacology, experimental pharmacology. That means day and night he does clinical trials and monitoring of the clinical trial and all kind of stuff. In his own institution, which is a well-known institution, one of the first public health institution that was established historically in India, the School of Tropical Medicine in Calcutta. He is the chairman, he is head of the department, professor, and he is also chairman of the drug management committee there. And not only there, with the government of India, with the drug regulator, he also acts as a assessor of the serious adverse events in clinical trial. He's part of expert committee of the clinical trial on the serious adverse event. So since Satyajit was talking about how these trials are designed to understand the safety of them, we don't have any better person from India than Shantanu to talk about it, because he has spent all his life to this, and he is on the cusp of his retirement time. So he has a massive experience with him. So Dr. Shantanu, are you ready?
First of all, thank you, Amar, for the kind introduction, and thanks, Sama, for giving me this opportunity. It was really great listening to Dr. Roth. Okay, it's absolutely from a different perspective, and I was just wondering that how in such a short time, such a excellently reviewed the uh, science behind the vaccine trials, and particularly when we are talking of a vaccine like COVID vaccine, many people have called it a pandemic vaccine, in fact, or developing vaccine in a pandemic speed. But then, what are the possible, uh, rather, the concerns that are inherently involved in this kind of a approach of developing a vaccine in a pandemic speed? We must always keep that in the back of our mind. Those of us who are interested in being a part of this kind of vaccine development, all of us want a vaccine, no doubt. But then how it is going to come, how it is going to finally reach to us. So thank you, Amar, thank you, Dr. Roth, and let me talk. I have been asked to talk on standard of care, serious adverse events, injuries, and deaths associated with or in reference to COVID vaccine trials, and all, of course, the compensation issues. And as you understand, that all these issues are really tenacious issues and create a lot of heat and a lot of debate. Okay, uh, the very understanding of these concepts, like if when you talk of standard of care, what we really mean by this phrase standard of care, will come one after another. But to start with, let us have a look at this vaccine life cycle. Of course, this is not a pandemic vaccine life cycle. Okay, it is in general the how a vaccine is developed. On your left hand side of the screen, the as you start from the first layer in that these squares, red squares, they are, let us consider, as Dr. Roth has mentioned, that candidate vaccines. These are all candidate vaccines. And as we proceed, you see the number of the candidate vaccines are gradually becoming less and less, very understandably, because these layers are actually acting as a filter. These layers actually represent basic research, discovery phase, then preclinical studies, then the clinical studies or clinical trials that also occur in sequential phases, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And then only the regulators will take a comprehensive look at it. If at all it comes up to this stage, many of the candidate vaccines will have a natural death in very early phase. But then if it qualifies to come to this level, then there will be review by the regulator. This is a bias, that because this is taken from United States regulator thing. So this is US FDA who are the regulator there. And then this is, if in case it is approved, you see it started with so many and we end up with this one. And then it is finally deployed, it is for the access. And even after the approval, the post approval monitoring is required and research is required. And in all these phases, safety is a priority during the development and the approval phase, and even in the post approval phase. So safety continues. Now, this is in general a non-pandemic situation, vaccine development. But in a pandemic situation, there has been a trend, or there has been approach is a different kind of approach where we are trying to squeeze these different layers, and in order to actually hasten the development. It's a simple logic that possibly we cannot afford to have the luxury of the usual kind of tapes, as it takes the long time, many years. Okay, so if we could squeeze them, of course, without compromising the safety and the quality of the development processes. So that lies the at the essence. As we go to the next slide, this is how the so-called pandemic vaccine development model has been proposed, and which is trying to be followed by many of the developers in many of the countries. And that is the outbreak paradigm. This is the traditional paradigm, multiple years requirement, which we discussed in the last slide. And this is the outbreak paradigm where people try to overlap some of the phases. And as Dr. Roth has mentioned, that vaccine platforms uh, in this phase, okay, that has to a large extent been enabled to squeeze this preclinical development, starting from the basic research and the discovery phase. That has been reduced to a great extent, okay, time-wise, and the vaccine platform technology, the new technologies. So it is kind of a, you can say, a vehicle, okay, where the same vehicle is being used to carry different people from one destination to another. So the platform is nothing like a vehicle that way. But then this is the outbreak paradigm. Here you see the, instead of that, in the particularly in the preclinical, we have said there is a lot of squeezing, and in the clinical development, you see the, instead of the traditional phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 phasing, here they have said that safety and dose selection and safety and efficacy. So there has been a clear tendency to merge the different phases and at an early date, so that it can come in the uh, general use. So, but then there are many debate in doing so. While we are trying to do this, Hari, whether we are also trying to compromise on the necessary uh, uh, the vigilance and also the attention that it otherwise requires, particularly from the point of safety and also appropriate efficacy evaluation. With these concerns in mind, it is very appropriate that we should think of the patient safety or the volunteer safety issues, and also if the candidate vaccine ultimately is licensed, then how safe it is uh, uh, to be rolled out, and how efficacious would it be also. Coming to the standard of care, in general, standard of care is actually refers to the degree of care, which means the watchfulness, attention, caution, and prudence that a reasonable person should exercise under the circumstances, under a given circumstance. This given circumstance can be referred to as the context. Now, the standard of care not necessarily has to be is applied in the drug or vaccine development context, but it is also in terms of the research, okay, or development, or in terms of the therapy, routine therapy also. Standard of care is equally relevant concept to be applied. And then again, according to that, when you say of care, who is providing care and who is receiving? So if it is in a routine care setting, it is the physician. If it is in the research setting, it is the researcher. Interestingly, in clinical research, the physician and the researcher is the same person, and there the problem comes. Okay, whether there could be the conflict of interest, whether the physician, while laying their hands in research, whether they can appropriately, which one it would put in the fore, whether his role as a physician or role as a researcher. That creates a confusion, and that's why there are many ethical dilemma, and appropriately such dilemma are to be confronted and addressed. The context of research again can vary. It can be a therapeutic research or a non-therapeutic experimentation. Like when you talk of vaccine research, it is actually a non-therapeutic experimentation, because it is healthy volunteers, healthy subjects. We give vaccines, preventive vaccines particularly. There is, of course, the scope for room for therapeutic vaccine rarely, but we are now talking of preventive vaccine. We are using vaccine to prevent a disease, so we are giving the vaccine to healthy people. So they are called non-therapeutic, and for that, whether this vaccine will work, for that we are clinically developing So that is a non-therapeutic clinical experimentation. So it is almost akin to what is done routinely in case of drug trial, phase 1 drug trial. So standard of care accordingly will differ. If I am diseased, the question of care will come. But if I am healthy, what kind of care I am actually referring to, you have to understand. The standard of care in therapeutic clinical trials mainly refers to the treatment that the subjects in the control arm are allocated to. But the same standard of care in a non-therapeutic clinical trial, whether it is phase 1 trial or vaccine trial, it actually refers to standard of prevention for all practical purposes there. In vaccine trials, we'll be considering standard of care is actually standard of prevention. Now, when you talk of standard of prevention, okay, whether that will be only applied to the control arm volunteers, or it should apply to all people who are participating in the trial, standard of prevention. By standard of prevention, we actually mean the usual or the common kind of public health preventive measures, like what we are all practicing these days, that is wearing mask, okay, the hand sanitization, keeping physical distance, etc., etc. Okay, so that is actually standard of prevention. Now, how many of our protocols of vaccine trials are giving emphasis on complying with this, or following with the standard of prevention for the volunteers, and how are you going to ensure this, that it is being appropriately implemented? Okay, so this here it comes, or whether we actually understand this concept of standard of prevention. Okay, so that is one thing that I thought that we should flag. Now, when you talk of standard of care in clinical trials, it was in 2000, year 2000, the World Medical Association modified the Helsinki Declaration and stated that the benefits, risks, burden, and effectiveness of a new method should be tested against the best current prophylactic, diagnostic, or therapeutic methods. Now, this best current methods, okay, when you talk of the best current method, based out of how many, what? And then this based current method will differ depending on the context. Okay, we'll come back to this. In 2002, the SIOMS guidelines took the debate a stage further by using the term established effective therapy to indicate a degree of consensus and acceptability among the health professionals about the nature of treatment. But in case of a non-therapeutic trial, this is not relevant that way. Okay, established effective therapy. But then if you say established effective public health measures, okay, which are considered to be, if we interpret it this way, which are otherwise believed to be, okay, effective in preventing the spread of the disease, so that should be also considered. But then again, there will be a difference. If when you say this, again, context wise, the same thing, if you are trying to actually accomplish in a setting of the urban educated population vis-a-vis urban relatively less educated or less conscious people who actually most of the time participate in trials. Okay, so it will again differ. So the because whether these people who are participating in the trial, they already are following this, or they are otherwise can be otherwise convinced or motivated to follow the preventive steps. If not, then who are going to take these responsibility, or be accountable for these to happen? So these are also issues that need to be really thought about. So far as these two attempts are concerned, neither of these actually specify if established efficacy therapy applies to a local or a global context. So that will vary. These days now, when we talk of development of COVID-19 vaccine, we have become more global. So any trial that is otherwise conceived in, say, USA or Europe or Australia, that is coming to India and it is being implemented locally in India. Okay, but whether the standard of care in, say, USA, or standard of care or standard of prevention for that matter in vaccine trial in Australia will equally apply in Indian local context, that is also a matter of debate. We need to consider this. Now, currently there is a wide variety of standard of care for the therapeutic clinical trials. These are the different phrases that are used in reference to standard of care: the highest attainable care, the best available care, the best current care, a proven treatment, established effective treatment, etc. But it has been questioned whether any of them is really adequate to serve a universal standard for the standard of care. We are not going into these details further. We can discuss this if there are specific questions on this. Now, coming to the next part. The next part is about that injury or death of a participant in a vaccine trial. Now, there are some inherent problem. I must again thank Dr. Roth because he has made my job simple by specifically identifying the different vaccine candidates and the possibility of specific kind of problems or specific kind of injury that can happen. Depending on the candidate vaccine, it will also differ. Okay, the nature of the injury and the probability of a death that can happen, okay, unfortunately, to a volunteer. But then inherently, the true vaccine related injury, identifying the true vaccine related injury is really challenging. There are primarily there is the basic understanding of the pathogenesis of such reactions. This is not very easy, and we have not achieved a lot yet. Many of the times the serious or the fatal reactions are rare, but by this rarity it does not mean that it is not important to study them, but it becomes difficult to study them. Non-specific nature of reactions that mimic the features of other diseases, okay, like Guillain-Barré syndrome, okay, even of the Oxford that Chaddock's one trial, we have seen there are reports of Guillain-Barré syndrome, but then later on they claim that it has nothing to do with this particular vaccine. But then that is a problem of really distinguishing between whether it is the vaccine that might have been contributing to development of this neurological complication or disease, or it is a natural progression of the disease. Pre-existing abnormalities evolving gradually that may cause confusion. That means at the time of vaccination, the child was absolutely all right, or the person was absolutely all right, but within 10 days there are some problem. It is difficult to decide whether it is the vaccine that has caused or the abnormality actually started prior to vaccination and it has evolved by itself. So these are some of the kinds of the cause and effect relationship establishment becomes inherently difficult in vaccine trials. Interpretation of adverse events will also vary depending on who is interpreting and how it is interpreted, and that can ultimately lead to over-reporting or even under-reporting of the adverse events. Causality assessment also will be is difficult and warrant different approach. Okay, we all know that adverse events following immunization, there the causality analysis is done in a different manner, which is very different from drug reaction causality by the WHO algorithm model or the Naranjo scale, etc. So they are not really followed in the adverse events following immunization causality, but of course that is under the program. The licensed vaccines, there when we do the causality assessment, we follow a different algorithm. But at least in India, so long the vaccines are being tried pre-marketing development stage, we do not find any specific vaccine-related adverse event causality analysis algorithm being referred to by the regulators. It is the same causality analysis rule or the relatedness, we call it rather study relatedness rather than only causality to the investigational product. Okay, so we'll come to that further. However, overall, it is believed that the costs and the logistics necessary to overcome these problems, inherent problems, for a prospective study of vaccine reactions seems prohibitive. The sponsors, okay, industry do not like to, okay, invest in this and try to come out with robust data regarding safety. That is the general tendency. Responsibilities for identifying vaccine-associated risks, promoting awareness of contraindications to vaccinations, and completing all of the steps required for vaccine improvement are really ill-defined and insufficient at the moment. So these are some of the areas where there are a lot of gaps, and we need to also try to bridge those gaps.
Shantan, a couple of minutes.
Let me see. Okay, I'm going fast then. These are some of the Common vaccine-related injuries: anaphylaxis, shoulder injury, vasovagal syncope, fever, neurological complications like GB syndrome. Antibody-directed enhancement is also another very troubling area we need to keep in mind. And of course, cytokine release syndrome, whether the vaccine candidate can also stimulate the possibility of cytokine release syndrome. These are, so we have to keep this in mind, but then there are many other unknown injuries that can also happen. Emergency use authorization is also another issue. Of course, up till now in India, we have not thought of this, but then if any vaccine is, there has been any attempt to get a vaccine in the market with emergency use authorization, we should remember that emergency use authorization is very, very different from full approval. So it is almost like just prior to final approval, we are trying to get it, make it available, okay, for the general public, but the same degree of scrutiny and vigilance must be there. Okay, so there will be continuous, contemporary and quick risk benefit assessment always. So unless that is assured, so emergency use authorization may rather be more dangerous, and there will be a lot of safety concerns. Compensation issues is only thing left now. The compensation, as we know, is a concept whereby we actually try to refill or remedy for any kind of loss, whether it is loss of time, professional time, whether it is loss of the wages, whether it is injury, etc. We try to compensate, and this compensation, the general tendency is compensation by financial means, pecuniary compensation. Okay, when somebody is participating in a trial, okay, there could be different types of compensation, and but then most important one is whether I am getting compensated if I suffer an injury, and if that injury is actually related to participation in the trial, whether I am being compensated adequately. Now, one area about this medical management of injury in trial participants, this is the New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules of 2019. That rule book says clearly that medical management is a responsibility of the sponsor, and if it is related, the sponsor will pay. But then most of the time in the budget, okay, whether there is some separate amount is kept for medical management, it is not. The general tendency is it is expected, which is very wrong. It hardly happens that the investigator will pay from his pocket or the institute will pay from his pocket, and later on it will be reimbursed. But then that hardly happens. By doing this, we are actually disrespecting the right of, or denying the right of the trial participant to get the best possible medical management. Okay, so this is one difficult area we need to handle. This is another, that is the consideration of injury and relatedness assessment. Here you see most of the time the sponsor has a tendency to start and end with this A, that is adverse effect of the investigation product, and stop it there. But then the next ones, particularly this one, the scientific misconduct or negligence by the investigator. Many a time the sponsor has a tendency to say, if it is medical negligence, then the Medical Council of India will look into it. Why should we pay the compensation for that? So this is a very intentional tendency to bypass these rules or laws. And we have very good laws, but then to what extent these rules are actually being implemented, or that is something we need to be concerned about. So this is another thing I thought that I should flag. We have mentioned about emergency use authorization. And lastly, we must say that there should be a trade-off, and this is the, if we start, whether it is a vaccine or a drug, if we want to be absolutely try to avoid the possible harm or absolute safety, that may not be always in the best interest of the public. On the other hand, like as you see here, this is maximum risk tolerance, and this is maximum risk aversion. A regulator which will try to achieve this absolutely avert the risk absolutely, will end up here. On the other hand, somebody else, there just the reverse. So somewhere here, this is the time across. So somewhere here we have to strike a balance. I think that was the last slide. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shantanu. I think India has a very eventful history of having controversies on adverse events, relatedness, uh, injuries, and compensation. That was the debate which actually forced the government to bring the new clinical trial rules ultimately. So we know that there are so many possibilities that vaccines, when they are being tried out, they are not always very innocent. They can really cause harm. And the harm to the participants is very, very important. At the same time, we also know that there is because of the lockdown, because of the economic derailment, because of the infections and some of the stories of the people dying of that and all kind of stuff that we see all the time. There are a lot of people who are going for volunteering to participate in the clinical trial. Now, what kind of issues that arises for them is very, very important. All those things that was talked about, science, efficacy of the candidate vaccine, and the adverse events it can cause, needs to be told to the participants. So it's very important to talk about how public education is done. There is a public engagement about the clinical trials going on the vaccine. And when the volunteers turn up saying that I want to do it because of the altruism, because my commitment to fight against pandemic, what kind of information the scientists who are doing, the doctors who are doing this clinical trial should be providing to them. So that is our third presentation, and we have after two doctors, we have a lawyer coming up, and that is Advocate Veena Johari here, and she will be sharing her PowerPoint. She is a practicing lawyer, and good part of her is that she's specializing on health-related laws, ethics, and access to medicines. For many years, I think more than a dozen years, she worked with the Lawyers Collective in the HIV/AIDS units. She also has done a lot of work on patent issues and intellectual property. And now she has her own law firm called Courtyard Attorneys. She is an external legal member in the Research Ethics Committee in India. That means she reviews the protocols that are taken up for clinical trial in India. And so she has a understanding about how the clinical trials are carried out at the ground level. And that includes protocols related to the COVID treatment as well as preventive vaccine.
Thank you, Amar, and thank you, Sarojini. And after such fantastic panelists, it's difficult to make a presentation after such wonderful speakers. But I would like to bring to the notice of everyone that in all these trials, etc., especially the vaccine trials, the participants need to be at the center of the discussions. And the participants' understanding of how things are rolling out is extremely important. And therefore, in this presentation, I hope to cover a few issues on informed consent and how it is taken and how it can be monitored, and on the nature of public engagement. So we can go to the next slide. We'll mainly look at the importance of informed consent, who the participants are in the trial, and what is the nature of their engagement. That's what we will try and cover in the next, I'll try and finish as quickly as possible. So basically, as both Satyajit and Dr. Shantanu explained, that they are mainly for these vaccine trials, which are the preventive vaccines. We are looking at healthy participants who are not exposed to COVID earlier. And they mainly are within the range of healthy people, within the range of 80 to 65. I think there are some BCG trials which are in the elderly, which are from about 60 to 65 to about 80, 85 years also. And there are 1 or 2 trials where they are thinking of enrolling children 12 years and above. Basically, they will screen, and they have a huge list of inclusion, exclusion. And classically, if they say screen 120 participants, they might be able to enroll maybe just about 30 or 40 participants. Please, Dr. Shantanu and Dr. Rath, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's generally the range of it. These trials, as you all know, are happening largely in government-run institutes, because ICMR is the co-sponsor for most of the trials. So the drug companies are the sponsors, but the ICMR is also funding the trials actually. And so they are happening through a lot of government institutes, and a lot of poor, vulnerable people do go to these institutes. So we know the kind of people who will be entering these trials and who are entering these trials. There are, of course, students also, because a lot of them are medical colleges, and there are healthcare workers who would all be categorized as vulnerable populations. And as you know, our rules and our guidelines, ICMR guidelines, have extra caution when you are enrolling vulnerable populations. But the main issue is, and as Sarojini mentioned in the opening, that there was an announcement yesterday that they will be rolling out the vaccine very soon, maybe by February. But one of the things that they have mentioned in that is that there will be, I think, some 30 crore people they will be enrolling. The government has decided how the distribution is going to be, and about 26 crores will be people who are above 50 years, and in special category below 50 years with comorbidities. But people who are enrolling in these trials do not have comorbidities, as both my earlier speakers said. So how will the vaccine work on them is something that probably will not be known. So if they give approval without determining this, we will have to be very careful of what the impact will be. Either they should do some phase 3 studies with patients who have comorbidities, and not classically only healthy people. Now, what is the nature of once you enter a trial, what is the nature of involvement of the people? Basically, classically, they are supposed to call through an advertisement, and this advertisement is generally read by the ethics committees and even approved by them. They are supposed to be. I don't know, the BCG trial in South India, there was some problem with the advertisement and it was out in the paper. You all must have heard about it. But wrong messages can give wrong messages to people. Oh, we are going to do this because it's going to help you out. Or there are nowadays, because of WhatsApp, etc., a lot of wrong messages are going through WhatsApp. And there is just no control. And in fact, I read a WhatsApp which says, oh, you enter this trial, if you're a healthy person, you have to visit 5 times and you're going to get 1,000 rupees. So it's more like an inducement to enter. And of course, there are political messages going around saying, oh, you must do this for the nation, etc. So is it really informed consent, or are people going for other reasons? Is it truly altruistic? Is something we need to be careful about. Once you enter, there will be a screening visit where they will look as per your inclusion-exclusion criteria. There will be vaccination visits, and as Satyajit mentioned, the first day or after 2 weeks or 4 weeks, then there will be follow-ups, and they are going to do weekly follow-ups, which could be telephonic, or you would have to come and give some samples. And they will be testing also whether you have become COVID positive or not. And they are given, classically, the participants are given diaries to fill in, if, just every day as to what adverse events or serious adverse events. Serious adverse events, they would have to anyway report it, but fill in the diary for any side effects, like you had fever, vomiting, etc. And end of study visit, and they are paid some amount per visit. Next slide, please. As Dr. Shantanu also mentioned, the compensation part is paid that way. But we have to remember that the basic principles of consent have to be followed. And most of the participants might already know this, but just for those who don't, I will quickly go through this, that We all have this right to autonomy and bodily integrity, and every adult of sound mind has a right to determine what should be done with his own body. And if consent is not taken, then it could amount to an assault or a battery, as we call in legal terms. Battery means that you have conducted a procedure on a person without taking the consent of that person, and it could be a wrong, even a criminal wrong in certain cases. Informed consent is basically when you're going to inform the person of what are the risks involved. Okay, what are the benefits, what are the risks, what are the alternates, and what is it that you have to do, so that the person can take an informed decision whether they want to enter the trial or not. And I would imagine if healthy people are entering the trial, they would have a whole lot of questions to ask, especially the Dr. Shantanu mentioned a long list of adverse events or serious adverse events that could happen, whether they are permanent or temporary. Can they be? Can these side effects go away quickly? How long will they take to go away? Or are they going to be of a permanent nature? So these are things that I would imagine a healthy person who is going to enter a trial would be asking of the participant. And there are people, as I've already mentioned, that they do enter trials just looking at media and WhatsApp messages, etc. And basically, we have to understand that the consent document is actually the most important document, because it's more like a contract between the principal investigator and the participant. And the consent, therefore, needs to be free and voluntary. And the person, there should be no coercion, there should be no undue influence, there should be no mistake, fraud, misrepresentation. There should be and undue influence is basically when one person takes advantage of the other. And the line is a little blur when you are unwell, or when you in therapeutic cases, because the doctor is primarily then going to decide, okay, let me try this drug on you, it might work. And is there an undue influence there, or is it not there? These are questions that need to be looked at carefully. But importantly, the language should be simple. It should not be too many medical terms or jargons which the person will not understand, and they will just leave it. Okay, anyway, in India, the doctor is largely considered as God, and the researcher, oh, if you're going to prevent me, and in these times, people are so desperate, and there is so much of fear and stigma that has spread, unfortunately, in the way that things have been handled. That people may just say, okay, whatever you say, I'll sign on the document, you just take me in. So it has to be also in a language that the person understands. Next slide, please. So I'm unable to see all of it for some reason, but anyway, so what is supposed to be the content of the consent form is, I just wanted to give you all a brief look into it. And mainly, the content document contains what is the purpose of the trial, why are we inviting you to enter the trial, okay, what is the design, how many arms are there in the trial. As Dr. Rath mentioned, there will be an experimental arm, there may be a placebo arm, whether it is blinded, double blinded, observer blinded, would you know in which arm you are, etc. All of that has to be mentioned in the consent form. Okay, who are the trial, who are the sponsors of the trial, who should a person contact in case they have any questions, if they want to complain about something, who they should contact. So generally, the contacts of the principal investigators are there, and also the contact of the local ethics committee is also mentioned in the document. What are the risks involved? What are the known risks? There could be some unknown risks that could occur, and that they should inform the doctor immediately. Reporting of side effects, alternatives, and of course, very importantly, that confidentiality will be maintained. Okay, duration of the trial, the number of participants who are going to be enrolling in this trial has to be mentioned, the number of visits that are required, and very importantly, the participant needs to know that they can withdraw at any time without giving any reason for withdrawal. Okay, they can refuse. They can even refuse If the trial is stopped for any reason, then reasons have to be given why it is stopped, and compensation is payable if there are any serious adverse events. And consent to enter the trial is also not only to enter the trial, but it's also to collect and use anonymized data to store the samples for the future, and those in the placebo arm to get the vaccine if it is proven to be efficacious, which will be a post-trial access that generally should be given. Next slide, please. So we will look at the legal ethical considerations in all of this, and is just signing of the document is not enough. Okay, you can say that this is documentary proof and oh, the patient has signed and so it's all right, but the participant needs to comprehend it properly. Okay, the rules and guidelines also state that there should ideally be audio visual consent for new chemical entities. And I would imagine that most of these new vaccines which are being fast tracked should actually have audiovisual consenting. But, these pharma trials and vaccine trials, the consent form is almost 16 to 25 pages long. So it does take a long time for, if a PI is doing a good job, that is the principal investigator is doing a good job, it should take at least half an hour to just for the consent process to take place, which should ideally be recorded in an audiovisual form. But I think that even though ICMR themselves have come out with these guidelines, there are some of the research trials, they do not necessarily insist on an audiovisual consent to be taken. Consent, actually, they are, because of the COVID times and because you need to maintain distancing, etc. And so they are allowing electronic consent also. But those who may not have access to electronic devices, it could be slightly problematic. It's something we have to look at. But most importantly is, how do we check whether informed consent is actually being taken properly or not? And there are two mechanisms. One is which the sponsor themselves actually regularly monitor at the site where the trial is going on, whether the PI and the institutions are following the protocol, etc. But the other is also the ethics committee, who has to regularly monitor the trials. And in fact, ICMR's COVID-19 guidelines, especially for COVID, which came out in April, they have insisted that all COVID-related trials have to be monitored by the ethics committees. So classically, when you go for monitoring, and I have just been for a couple of them, what is it that you're going to look for? And you're going to look at whether the signatures are there, the thumb impressions are there if they are illiterate participants, and there are quite a few illiterate participants where you would require an impartial witness. You will check the date, the signature, etc. And you will see if, in fact, the ethics committee members who are doing the monitoring, they can even call the participants and ask them if really informed consent was taken, did they understand why they are in the trial, etc., which would be an ideal situation. I don't know how many ethics committees are really following that, but this is an ideal situation. If the ethics committee is good, then they will actually check into these things very closely. And also, the entire consent procedure has to be written properly. Like, right by, that is how generally trials are done. When the participant came in, what time they came in, what was explained, what was done, it has to be very detailed. So generally the PIs have very detailed note taking, which can be checked by the ethics committee members. And if the audiovisual consent is also taken, they can see the audiovisual, they can see who is giving, because only the principal investigators or the co-investigators should be taking the consent. It shouldn't be the collaborator or the coordinator or any other person who is involved in the trial. And you can make out, actually, when you look at some of these audiovisual consents, whether the participant is understanding or they are just nodding their head and happy to be on camera, or and are they asking questions. Okay, so these are things that actually determine whether the consent is being taken properly or not. Next slide, please.
In a couple of minutes.
Yes, I'm almost done. So the importance of informed consent is, as you all have seen, that you have to give relevant and complete information. Competence of the participant is important, comprehension and voluntariness. Participant is involved in research actively. He understands and helps researcher by noting adverse events. So if you actually, involve the participant right from the beginning, into these things, they are going to not only understand better, but they will help you in your research. They will tell you, okay, I had this adverse event, I had this serious adverse event, and they will understand the importance, because a lot of participants are even lost to follow up, or their phone numbers are wrong, or their addresses they have moved out, etc. So these problems then may not arise if you give importance to the ICD document. And then if you conduct the trial thinking that the participant is an equal partner in the research and not merely a subject. Okay, next slide, please. And now I'm just going to very briefly tell you about the involvement or the engagement of the public, and why it is so important for the public to be engaged right from the beginning, right from when you are even thinking of conducting the trials till the end. And how people's participation is so important is something that we will have to see, because we have heard, on the one hand, there is this one organization called One Day Sooner. They have stated that, that there are already 30,000 volunteers who have signed up with them who want to enter trials. But on the other hand, there are also reports of almost 50 to 60% of people who say that even if there is a vaccine, we will not take it. And what is the reason of this mistrust? Why will they not take it? Is because they feel, oh, it's being taken in much haste and we don't know whether, it is being done properly. And plus, in India, there is this general feeling that are the authorities really being vigilant about it? Or is there corruption, etc.? There are these notions that people have, which are very deep-rooted and maybe even valid notions that we have to look at. And important to involve the communities. Even the ICMR guidelines, incidentally, talk about the importance of involving the communities. But how much are they themselves doing it? We don't know. There is an expert committee, but who are the members of the expert committee? We do not know. Okay, have they taken advice from community leaders or from people who work with communities? We don't know whether they have done that or not. In the next slide, please. The importance of engaging. The one thing good is that ICMR has on their portal, they have, they have listed which are the vaccines that are currently, being tried in humans, and at what stage they are. I won't go into it because my earlier two speakers have already spoken about it, but Bharat Biotech is doing the Covaxin, Serum Institute is doing Covishield, and Zydus Cadila are doing the Zycov-D vaccine. And that website has all the updates and etc. You can have a look at it. But what is really important is to give honest information to the participants. What is this emergency use? Should emergency use be done for a vaccine? I mean, one can, for the treatment, a lot of emergency use was given to some of the drugs, but we don't know actually, because it's not in the public domain, as to what all has the DCGI looked at. So there is the select expert committee, and they are supposed to look at how the trials are going on and whether this experimental drug is working or not. But what is the data that they are looking at? Because basically it's the industry who is going there, making a presentation and saying, well, this is very good, you give us emergency use approval. And that is what is happening. But are they looking at the markers? Are they looking at all the testing data? Are they looking at the DSMB board reports? Are they even asking the ethics committee for their monitoring reports, etc.? Is something very questionable. And it's something that I think has to be looked at more carefully. The message has to go out that this is not a miracle cure or a quick fix thing. People are getting this thing, oh, once the vaccine is out, we'll be fine. We can start our normal life. We don't have to wear the mask, etc. But you need to give correct information to the people. Okay. And even there is a little bit of distrust whether the DCGI will look into it properly or not, etc. Because of these reasons, especially in the recent past, as far as therapeutic drugs are concerned. And you need to involve the public in developing guidelines, not just for conducting the trials, but also for prioritizing and distribution of the vaccine. Who should get it first? Because everyone is not going to get it first. So who's going to decide that? But apparently it's already decided by the experts of the government and the government bodies. And they are going to decide that 1 crore will be given to healthcare workers, 2 crores will be given to frontline workers, municipal workers, police and army, and 26 crores will be given to some special category people. So that has been decided. But how many have they done it? Have they come to this figure through some kind of participatory involvement or not is really questionable. Next slide, please.
Veena, can you?
Yeah. So this is the last slide. I'm finishing right here. You all can read this, that abroad there have been many reports, and people have written about how the public can involve themselves better, and how the people in charge should involve them in all that they are doing. And just my last concluding slide, if you can go to the last slide, please, that it is important for government, donors, public health experts, scientific community, policy makers to involve the public at every step. The government should be open, transparent in their functioning and dealings about the vaccine trials, development and distribution. There is responsibility and accountability needs to be fixed and emphasized, and compensation should be payable. Informed consent and participant comprehension are important. Medical, ethical, and legal standards and the right to autonomy, right to health, right to life of people needs to be upheld in any public health discourse of vaccines. This is my last slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Veena, for tackling a field which is so controversial and so problematic. There are, what are the people's perception, how they are being, explained about the kind of research that is going on, and then those volunteers who come forward, the participants of the trial, how they are treated and how they are explained. I think the role of ethics committee is very, very crucial, because they are the regulator at the site. And if they work well, they should be able to do a lot. I was quite impressed by the kind of monitoring that ethics committee should be doing. But at the same time, I think it may be necessary to find out, whether it's not just paperwork and looking at the video. What is very important is that what people understood when they agreed to participate. Did they understand the right thing? Because if there is too much of propaganda in the public domain, people do get what we call therapeutic misconception. They think that this is the vaccine which is going to protect them, and that may create really a problem. So I think this is a very, very critical area, and we need more discussion. And I hope in the next half an hour we will have a good discussion here. There are questions. I think because Satyajit started first, there are many for him, many issues for him. And let me start. I think other can also answer those questions which have come. One is that there are human rights issues around the way trials are carried out. Once upon a time, there were certain kind of specific kind of people who were exploited, like prisoners. There are a lot of experiments done on the prisoners earlier, and the phase 1 clinical trial and that kind of stuff. The people who are in custody and captive population. So where do the this kind of utilization of vulnerable people fit into the entire research perspective? And there is another issue, which is human rights issue, is that there are rich countries who have already done the advanced purchasing of the vaccine. They may be getting it, and the people in the developing countries are not getting it. But there is a second set of human rights issue. Would you like to respond? Any one of you would like to respond to this human rights issue which are put on board at the moment? Satyajit or Veena or Shantan or whoever.
Sure. Well, clearly, involuntary volunteers are utterly unethical and should never be used under any circumstances whatsoever. In fact, the verb use should not be part of any vaccine trial at all. Honestly, of any efforts that uses human volunteer participants. It's as far as I'm concerned, it's as flat as that.
And in COVID context, there is another question that has come up, which is that that before before a vaccine is proved to be safe for healthy people, should it be tried out with the old people and people with comorbidities, because they are the most vulnerable, and perhaps medically they need protection more than the young people and people who are not having comorbidities. So tell me, is there a human rights issue involved here also, or ethical issue involved here?
I'm laughing because I was going in that direction of saying that there are 2 or 3 odd issues in the COVID-19 context. One which you've raised, Amar, of should vulnerable people get access first? And there are 2 categories of vulnerable people we should point out. One is those who are made vulnerable by their professions. First-line responders, healthcare workers, and by healthcare workers, I mean janitorial staff and ambulance drivers and attendants. I must confess, far more than the physicians who have first access to PPEs. There are class issues here as well. But that's a separate category from those with comorbidities who, as we all know by now, are particularly vulnerable. The distinction is that the initial results of clinical trials are likely to provide at least some rationale and justification about protection, about the professional vulnerables. But it will not provide any realistic information about protection for the comorbid vulnerables. And I hope everybody can see why I'm making these 2 separate categories. So we need to think, when we think about this, it's not a straightforward problem. I'm not offering a solution, but when we think about these, we need to think about these 2 groups as separate and distinct groups. Sorry. Shantanu was
Shantanu, yeah.
So I would look at this issue from 2 angles. One is, once the vaccine is licensed, the issue of equitable distribution. So it is there. There also there is a possibility that somebody will get, somebody will not get. People are more vulnerable not to get it. Okay. But then when you talk of clinical trial setting, as far as I am concerned, the few protocols that I have seen, there at least it has not been in the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Okay. And also I had the opportunity to also interact with some people who are working as the investigator in some of the trials. There at least there has not been a very clear distinction that you only use really healthy volunteers, although we are saying healthy, but by saying healthy, we are actually meaning they are not suffering from COVID. Okay, or there is no, even again, Satyajit has mentioned already that in order to speed up things, as compared to other kind of regulatory trials, okay, phase 2, phase 3 trials, here the screening is relatively less strict. Okay, so we are saying that, are you healthy? You do not have any symptom. Okay, or at the best the clinical examination, medical examination, but we are not going to a very long list of battery of tests. Okay, to establish really he is otherwise how healthy he is, although he might not have a symptom, but he is otherwise a poor kidney function. So this is most of the trials what I find in the inclusion-exclusion criteria, it is not there. Again, the argument is, in any case, after the trial, this thing comes in the market, then we are not going to discriminate to that extent. Okay, so anybody and everybody who is at risk of contracting COVID will require a vaccine. Okay, but then so far as I give specific example of say diabetes patients who are considered to be more vulnerable, hypertensive subjects, heart failure patients, whether they can volunteer in COVID-19 trial, the answer is yes. So long they are under well controlled. If they are at the present moment well controlled, okay, they are welcome to participate in trial. So from that angle, I think this discrimination or the relatively more vulnerable people are given more priority. It's at least not happening in clinical trial in India. Over.
Shantanu, there is a one question often asked is that if somebody has got infection and it was say asymptomatic and that where it was missed, but if that person is given this vaccine,
Very
would it
interesting.
create a problem?
Yeah. Interestingly, it is a policy now in India that we are not going to make him a RT-PCR testing as a part of screening. I'll be doing an RT-PCR, but it is not being done as a part of screening.
Oh,
so yeah.
Why is it so?
One thing is what I can understand that if you make it a screening test, then you have to wait for say 48 hours to get the test result.
Is that a very long time?
Usually it is on an average it is say 24 hours at least. If this 24 hour will also make a lot of difference because that person will go back and is unlikely to come back. Okay.
Oh.
So this is one possible logic, one possible reason.
So this is not a science, this is a convenience, yeah?
Yeah, they're there. In trial, it is not just science. In trial also,
really?
lot of convenience is also there. You have to also see because when you are trying to do it at a faster rate, okay. The other issue is even the serology. Serology is not also as per the design. Okay, what is a consensus in India? Neither serology nor antigen testing is a part of the screening tests. They are being done, but they are not being done as a part of screening test. Now, what is the possibility that after 48 hours you find somebody is positive? Then what do? Do you give him the second dose? The answer is if, and then the other question is if it is most of these are 2 doses, okay, in between the 2 doses, the window, if somebody suffers, if somebody is infected and he is to be hospitalized, whether that hospitalization will be considered as an SAE, the answer is yes. But then whether this SAE hospitalization will be considered as related, it could be yes, it could be no, depending on the context. But then he is hospitalized, then after say 14 days he is discharged from the hospital. Should he get the second dose? The answer is yes. So many of the protocols, if you see that, but then how they will be finally analyzed. There will be one cohort of people, one cohort of participants who are really healthy insofar as COVID is concerned at the beginning, and they have not contracted the disease during the window, okay, and some of them may contract the disease say after 2 months of the second dose. So that is actually possibly lack of protection, okay. But then the end point is not really how many of them are getting COVID. The end point is actually the immunogenicity, okay, the titer of the antibody or the T cell mediated immunity. So that is the end point. Whether somebody is getting enough antibody, whether somebody is who is not having antibody earlier, we are assuming. But then that is the end point. Immunogenicity is the end point in many cases, in most of the cases. Although this is also an thing, how many are actually getting protected, but then the duration of the monitoring, okay, that is also usually too short. So during this duration, if somebody is not getting COVID, but then beyond your monitoring period, somebody contracts. So whether you consider it the vaccine is efficacious or not, that means it is also important that how long you are monitoring. If the vaccine is protecting, how long it is protecting, okay. Whether the protection is 4 months or 6 months or 1 year, that is also relevant. But unfortunately, currently, most of the trial designs are not trying to actually monitor efficacy for a pretty long time. So that.
I think that was the point Satyajit had made. Satyajit, for you, there is another set of questions which are all related to the outcome measures. And they say that this 50% efficacy cutoff, I mean, from where does it come? Is there any document of Indian regulator which is saying that, or it's a policy statement or something like that? But apart from that, that okay, you can debate it whether 50 should be there or not. But people want to know your viewpoint, that what should be the outcome measure, which is the ideal outcome measure that you would like to see in the protocols of the COVID vaccine. This is the question, which is, I think, very tough, but you will have to try.
I have yet to see a formal statement by any regulatory authority, a formal operative document by any regulatory authority that lays out what the expected threshold for licensing would be, expected efficacy threshold for licensing would be. The US FDA has put out preliminary statements saying that it is likely to expect what I mentioned, which is 50% with 30% bottom. The EMA, the European Medicine Agency, has actually given apparent indications that it might even consider lower efficacy threshold. The source of these numbers has by and large apparently been modeling for public health purposes to ask what level of efficacy, what percentage of efficacy would have a meaningful consequence for the speed of transmission of the epidemic. And that's a very sort of public health government perspective on trying to bring the speed of the spread of the epidemic down. And if you can use the vaccine as an instrument for that, then of course it's useful. On the other hand, the way that we in the media and in ordinary public discourse are talking about it, we're really talking about individual protection. And a 50% efficacy does not bode well for anybody's sense of personal individual security and protection. So there are these contrasting pulls on how to set the threshold. What would I like? I would like not this slightly wimpy golden middle of an outcome that all the trials are doing. I would actually like vaccine trials to look carefully at both ends. One end where I would like them to provide very, very substantial protection against severe COVID-19 illness, because none of us honestly cares at the individual level if we are infected without anything apart from a couple of days of cough and fever. So I would like to see that as one component of protection, but completely at the other end of the infection spectrum, I would like to see whether the vaccine provides for an enormous reduction in the amount and duration for which I excrete the virus, I throw the virus out if I'm infected. The first you will notice is about personal protection for people as individuals at large. The second you will notice is about the public health component, where the measure I want is not whether people are getting sick or not, but how much and for how long are they transmitting virus. So those are really the considerations that ought to have driven this. And if you look at the proposal for the WHO Solidarity Vaccine Trial, some of these considerations, I don't think it goes as far as I would have liked it to go, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, some of these considerations were built into that. Let me address the other point, taking forward what Shantanu said about the issue of prior exposure. As I said, some of these trials globally are excluding prior exposure by doing a serological rejection. Some of them are not. My problem is, we don't know what the consequences are if I've been exposed, but I fall into a significant minority of people who, even when they've been exposed and got better, haven't made antibodies. There are anecdotal reports including from within India by now, that up to 25-30% of people who have been asymptomatically infected never make antibodies. So if it's that mild an infection, I haven't made antibodies, I won't be excluded by serology, but am I a separate group that responds differently? These are the sorts of issues that a slow, boring, careful trajectory of vaccine development would have addressed steadily.
I think
our fundamental difficulty is the warp speed approach that under Mr. Trump's language we have all adopted.
Dr. Shantanu, because we have only 10 minutes left and there are so many questions. I think one set of questions is for you and one set is for Advocate Veena. So, because we have only 10 minutes left, and if you can give brief answers. The one question for Dr. Shantanu is that, is there any kind of a no-fault compensation scheme worked out for the for participants in the COVID vaccine trial? The Gavi is talking about no-fault compensation when the vaccine is actually delivered. Or there are governments which have given no liability guarantees to the pharma companies, product liability guarantees. All those things are there. But at the moment, we are talking about the participants. Is there any kind of a national level arrangement worked out by the government for all the vaccine trials which are going on in India to monitor people who get injured or die in the clinical trial and provide them compensation with a committee of experts or something like that?
To the best of my knowledge, so far as the development of vaccines are concerned, there is no separate scheme of paying compensation. It will be equally like the drug trials. Okay. But otherwise, as I know, in September only, there were the government of India was in talk with World Health Organization and that COVAX plan, that whether that is particularly for after a vaccine is licensed, even then it can cause injury. So in order to cover those injuries, the no-fault compensation under the COVAX plan, that may be put in place. But right now, it has not been finalized as far as I know. Okay, that is under consideration.
There is a supplementary question here that are these trials designed to find out birth defect which can be caused by the vaccine? Because the duration of the time is such a small. And secondly, I don't know whether they are deliberately excluding the pregnant women from the trial. And even if they exclude them after the follow-up, they become pregnant and there is a late effect of the vaccine. Is there any kind of thinking on this about the birth defect and all? No.
Yeah. Most of the protocols, they try to avoid the people of females of childbearing age who are not practicing contraception. Okay, and at each level, okay, at each time that pregnancy test will also be done, but there is always a possibility that there will be non-compliance and somebody will conceive. But in such a situation, not only in vaccine trial, in any kind of regulatory trial, the responsibility is, even if the duration of the monitoring, active monitoring is for 6 months or whatever, 4 months or 6 months, but then if somebody has conceived, okay, then it is absolutely binding on the sponsor or the institute to also follow them up until the birth of the baby and beyond that also in certain cases.
Okay, I think Veena, one set of questions for you before Sarojini winds up everything and tells you about the next seminar. Veena, people are wondering, you were describing a monitoring process of the clinical trial. People are wondering that, are these ethics committee really doing monitoring? Do they go there and try to find out what is happening? Or this is all on the paper? And secondly, if I am a concerned citizen of this country and I want to find out whether all the information was given and understood by the participants and that kind of stuff, what is the mechanism for me to find out that these clinical trials are conducted in the manner as it is written in the ethics guidelines and all the policy papers and all? Do you know anything about it? Because these are the questions that have come from the participants.
So monitoring does happen where the ethics committees are active and very good and vigilant. They generally do monitoring. They do it either, they set it, if it is a high risk trial, they would do it after the enrollment of the first few participants, or at 50% of how many are supposed to be enrolled in the institution, or at the end of it. But they do the monitoring, and then they do ask questions to the PI or the sponsor, and they check if the trial has been going properly or not. But places where the ethics committees are not so vigilant, I don't know what is happening there. There would be lapses for sure. Now, you cannot get the information about a participant through an RTI, because it would come under a confidentiality clause. And so you would never know, but you could, even the protocol, they will not reveal in an RTI. Actually, in this emergency situation, they should just put it up on the website. They should be open and transparent about it, because at the end of the day, the government is pumping in money, and a lot of money, in conducting these trials. In fact, the pharma companies are manufacturing it and doing some part of it, but the government, and that is our money, is going into it. So all of this should be in the public domain as it is. But whether the participants have truly understood or not, that only an ethics committee member could, who wants to be, proactive, they can call up some of the participants and find out, or you could, probably a participant themselves can come forward and tell how their experience about it. But otherwise, it's I think it's very difficult to even find who the participants are. How are you going to find, once they get the shot, they've gone, you're not going to get that information easily. I don't think so.
So it must be very difficult to sit on ethics committee. We keep approving protocol without
Yeah,
knowing what happens to the protocol after we approve. I also sit on ethics committee, so I
yeah,
know the dilemma that one goes through.
yeah.
So yeah, I understand that there is a confidentiality, and so you cannot provide this information. But the participants can talk, and they are going to talk, right? In the next webinar, in the webinar number 2, when we are going to have report from the ground, and where we will try to test out whether what you are talking about, the kind of information that should be made available to the participants, was really made available to them or not. At the same time, perhaps I think some independent agency, social scientists or something like that, they should have been doing this research on these participants to find out why they came to participate, with what kind of expectation or misconception they came. Were those misconceptions cleared by the researchers? Really made them understand what was the science behind the trial that is being carried out, and whether it will really be a good a technology to fight against the pandemic. All those kind of stuff, issues are there. Perhaps some research could answer this question, but I don't know whether such research is going on. I don't know whether government or the institutions where clinical trials are being done have encouraged university social scientists to come and look at what is happening there. I hope they do it, or hopefully, as a part of this process, we all can raise this concern and say that, well, this kind of research is necessary in order to see that next time when this kind of trials are done, they are done better than what we have been doing here. Anyway, we are asked.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, my question is to all of you, and Satyajit can also give. That is, once a first vaccine comes, and then if you have to design a protocol for the another vaccine trial, would it be fair to do it a placebo-controlled trial? I'm talking from the perspective of standard of care and standard of prevention. When
this
you
is
have
not
an option,
this is not a scientific question. This is an ethical question.
Yeah, ethical question. Yes.
So Satyajit, as a scientist, what do you feel?
Use of placebo. Unmute yourself.
Honestly, this was one of the many issues that the WHO Solidarity Vaccine Trial design actually explicitly intended to address.
Absolutely.
They said we can do a comparative evaluation if everybody participates. So it would have been treated ethically as a scientific question and dealt with if it had not been for vaccine capitalism and vaccine nationalism.
But it failed.
Each company wants to be first so that their vaccine becomes the standard
and
becomes the market leader. But Shantanu, tell me, since we are talking about this issue, Remdesivir is given a complete marketing approval by the American FDA. Right, full marketing approval.
Right.
It is the standard of care, right, for the antiviral activities of this drug. Now, all antiviral that are being tested at the moment in clinical trial, should they be using Remdesivir as a control arm?
That's again the issue. Whether a local standard or a global standard will be used, whether Remdesivir is a local standard in this country. So
Remdesivir is also given emergency approval here. So
emergency use authorization is very, very different from a full approval. Emergency use authorization is an extension of, you can say, a phase 3 trial. Okay, it's not approved.
But Dr. Shantanu,
authorization puts the regulator into an additional kind of responsibility of getting the safety and efficacy continuously being scrutinized and evaluated, which is not being done probably. That's another issue.
Dr. Shantanu, isn't there a double scientific standard here that we use American data to give emergency access to the Remdesivir, but we refuse to use the same American data to give it full approval? How is it?
No, I'm not. I'm not arguing in favor of regulator or this. What I'm raising the issue of. I'm raising the issue of which one you will be accepting as standard of care. There is no consensus in that whether a local standard or a global standard will be used as the standard. Is there any universal standard for that matter?
But
that's my question.
I think Remdesivir seems to be an Indian standard. I go, all the patients are being prescribed by it. Yeah, Satyajit, last point.
No. I was just commenting that the WHO Solidarity drug trial shows that Remdesivir doesn't actually help very much at all.
Yeah.
So there is a big fight going on, right? And Veena, you have to say anything. Last one sentence.
I think we have to involve the participants right from the beginning. And, there are going to be so many questions. Until you don't involve the participant as an equal partner, you're not going to get anything out of it. You can have as many rules as you want and you can have whatever you want, but at the end of the day, you have to involve them at some level.
Okay, thank you very much. We have run out of time, and I believe that there are many more questions have come, but we can't do it. And even earlier questions, I tried to combine a few questions together. So my apology if any detail was left out. But these questions could be debated through email or some other way. Yeah.
Can anyone take a copy of all these questions and
I think
circulate
the Sama can do it and then circulate. And if you want to put up the answer in writing, then you can do it. So I hand over to Sarojini, who is coordinating this series and with the support of Sama's technical support from Sama, and she will tell you about what is forthcoming webinar of this series. Sarojini?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks once again to all the speakers and the participants, and Amma particularly for moderating. Many interesting and important questions, and we are documenting and sharing the questions with the speakers here. And then if you require, we can provide the email IDs if you want to contact them directly. The recording will be available on YouTube and the PPTs will be available on Sama website. We shared the link on the chat box. And the next webinar, it is on the 9th. We have 5 webinars, as we mentioned in the beginning itself, and all are looking at what we have said, looking at the ethics and the research and the regulatory, and also looking at the public health system from an equity and intersectionality lens. So from a scientific angle. And then the next is on the 9th, the same time, 3:30 to 5:30. The topic is COVID vaccine trials, experiences and opinions from the ground. It is a moderated panel with the testimonies and experiences and insights of those closest in the clinical research environment. That is like the clinical trial participants who are a part of the vaccine trials. They will be speaking about their experiences, and then we have the principal investigators, what it means to conduct a vaccine study from the investigator point of view, and other is on the politics of the COVID vaccine, both from the ethics committee perspective and also from the public health and activist perspective. We have one panelist speaking, and then we have the media person who are all not only this particular but the overall coverage on the vaccine and how media is reporting on it. So we have five panelists here: Mr. Hanil Hebbar, Ms. Vaishali, and Sanjay Mehendale, Rama Baru, and Amitabh Sinha. And it has been moderated by Sandhya Srinivasan, who is a freelance health writer and consulting editor for the IJME, Indian Journal of Medical Ethics. So we will be sharing the link. We have already shared. It is on the Twitter and Facebook, and we will be sharing. Please write to us, and then you can join directly. The link, we'll be putting it up on the chat box also. Please do join on the 9th. And the next one is not very far, actually. It is on the 11th. And then we hope you all will be attending all the 5 series, and then collectively we can think, how do we take this forward, not with that warp speed, but in our own way, protecting the rights of the clinical trial participants, and then holding the science and ethics the way we would like to see. Thank you all. Thank you very much.